Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining this virtual panel. Um, we have today an exciting, I think, group of panelists from a variety of different venture and other investment funds. And we're very excited to hear from them and then hopefully take questions as well from the audience. Before we do that, I think it'd be helpful just to do a quick introduction of each of us, for the benefit of everyone joining here. My name is John Rudy, and I'm a member at Mintz Levin in Boston, capital markets and securities lawyer. We do a significant amount of our work in the life sciences space, biotech, therapeutics, but also some med device, med tech, and other things, and work both on issuer side and on underwriter and bank side, and also have a venture practice. And work with private companies as they move towards, either a public exit or M&A. We did the same role in the conference last year in person in Stockholm, and so are happy to be back doing this again. Unfortunately, virtually, but very very appreciative that LSX and the organizers were able to pull this together like this. So with that, maybe I will. I'm looking at my screen, so I'll start on the left with Rachel. I don't know if everyone's screen is organized the same, and ask her to just do a quick introduction of herself.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here. So I'm Rachel Mears. I am a partner with JTO Capital. We're a venture fund that closed on our first fund in late December of last year. We're based in Paris, and my co-founder was Raphael Torjman, who is a longtime venture capitalist in Europe, previously at Sofinnova. By way of background, like you, John, I started my career as an attorney, reformed fairly quickly into a 20-plus year career in biopharma, and trained as a chemist, but spent most of my time in the industry and business transactions and strategy. It's great to be here.
Great, thank you, Rachel. Petros, you're next on my cube grid here.
Sure. Thank you. So I'm Petros. I'm with Vickers Venture Partners. We're a global venture capital firm investing in deep tech and biotech around the globe. We're raising our sixth fund now. We've got about 3 billion under management. So we've been doing this for quite a while, and now we've got 8 offices worldwide, headquartered in Singapore, and sort of offices across Asia, US, and London is our newest office, from where it's sort of a springboard from where we're covering the whole of Europe. We invest in sort of around Series A is typically our first investment into a company, and obviously we follow on after that, and we look for companies with a lot of strong proprietary technology, that's platform technology, that have known and growing markets.
Thank you. That's great. Sasha, you're up next on my screen.
Hi, everyone. Nice to be here. I'm Sasha Lilovic. I'm managing partner at SHS. SHS is a healthcare investor for more than 25 years now, based in Germany. I think we are the only one on this panel from the investor side who do not invest into drug development. So we focus on medtech, diagnostics, health tech. I would say everything within healthcare that is not drug development. We manage 300 million currently with different fund generations. We've closed our 5th fund July last year. Have done 7 investments out of it, and yeah, looking to do up to 15 investments in total from that fund. Myself, I mean, my background is a lot in transactions, capital market, M&A transactions, investments. Yeah, I'm looking forward to the discussion here.
Thank you. Thierry, you're next up on the roster here. And great to meet you.
Yeah, great to meet you too. Thank you for inviting me. So I'm Thierry. I'm a founder and a partner at Kurma. Kurma was started a bit more than 10 years ago. Our main office is in Paris. We have a second office in Munich, Germany. We have approximately 700 million euros under management or under mandates for some of our LPs. We invest, as Sasha mentioned, we do invest in drug development, but not only drug development. We also like diagnostic and digital diagnostics in particular, and we have a dedicated team that work in this space. We invest early stage, including company creation. We are very active in creating companies that represent approximately 1/3 of our portfolios. The rest is, I would say, traditional VC investment from Series A in syndication with all the guys around the table and more.
Great, thank you. And Stefan, if you want to finish out the round.
Happy to do so. Stefan Kriskov, I'm from IR Ventures, a brand new venture fund. We just announced the first close here on 10th of July. We are a fund based in the Nordics. We have offices in Stockholm and Copenhagen. We will invest primarily in therapeutic projects, but can also do medtech and digital health. And we can invest in the very early stages and be active as company creating investor, but can also go further up and invest in late stage. My own background is I was involved in setting up Novo Seeds in Novo Holdings 13 years ago. And before then, I'm a scientist and have been operationally involved in a number of biotech companies. And all of us in IR Ventures are having that mixture of investment experience and also operational experience from biotech companies.
That's great, thank you. So the topic of this panel, I think, is kind of laid out, is pretty broad. What strikes me, just with each of your backgrounds and the backgrounds of your funds, as coming from a U.S. perspective, is it's an exciting bunch of it sounds like both new and existing VCs. That it cuts a little bit against the kind of conventional wisdom in the U.S. of the ecosystem, the VC ecosystem in Europe being somewhat less developed, somewhat less mature than that in the U.S. And so I think it would be maybe a kind of exciting place to start. And we can narrow in a little bit more in the Nordic region as we go along, but maybe an exciting place to start with each of you just getting your perspectives on the European VC ecosystem and how it kind of compares to the U.S. And where you see that evolution going. I know yesterday a number of us were able to connect, and we all kind of remarked on the continued imbalance in the European life science space between the availability and access to capital and the many high quality opportunities in Europe, and the way in which that imbalance is kind of a fundamentally different situation than that in the U.S. So I guess maybe to put it into kind of a question, more broadly speaking, do you see the European venture community evolving to address that imbalance? And is it evolving rapidly? Is this a slow evolution? And more narrowly, with respect to each of your funds, how is your fund approaching it in terms of its strategy, in terms of how it works with other VCs and deals, how it sources its deals, how it works with management teams? There's a lot there, so feel free to pick and choose. And I hate to start in the same order again, but it seems like it works really well. So if that's okay with you, Rachel.
That's okay, John. I think too, because you did the compare and contrast. I'm actually based in New York, so I'm the JTO partner based in the United States, and so it's an obvious contrast for me pretty much every day, but in a good way. So the very first thing that I would say is to acknowledge that imbalance, but perhaps from my perspective and from JTO's perspective, to acknowledge it as an awareness. I think if you talk about all of us sitting around the table, we're very aware of it. I don't think it means that it's intended in that imbalance to be perfectly corrected yet, but I think we're all looking at the fact that Europe, and the Nordics included, have strong science, they have strong entrepreneurs, and many great academic institutions that are going to bring out, especially in the area we focus on, which is therapeutics, strong opportunities. The lack of available capital in some cases, and at least in our investment thesis, continuity of capital, which is the ability to predictably through us, through others, through syndication, provide some stability of capital to these entrepreneurs, particularly early, is part of what we think is the value that a fund like JATO brings. And so our strategy is pretty much, look, we're going to do exactly what we should be doing in the market. Look for the opportunities with the strongest entrepreneurs backed by the best science, but make sure we're at the table with an investment thesis that alleviates that imbalance early enough that the company can be formed, or if it's Series A, put on a track that allows it to develop its drugs or its platform with sufficient capital that it's not making choices it shouldn't have to make, and perhaps sacrifice or sequence value that doesn't maximize the overall opportunity. So we have a pretty clear investment strategy that does kind of focus on that imbalance, but not in a way that we in effect around the table think it's something that's going to be cured and therefore create a hyper competitive environment for deals. In fact, I think one of the things we talked about as panelists already together as we got to know one another a little more is the fact that, in contrast to the US, I think there's a decent amount of cooperation amongst funds. We do a lot of cooperation, sharing of opportunity, and syndication, and that it's not a sense from our perspective that opportunities are lessening as more venture funds come to the table, or the awareness becomes more known even outside of Europe. In fact, we think it's created an opportunity to have a really firm investment thesis. So that's my first take as somebody from the US, which is, I don't think that anytime soon is the environment going to look like venture in the US, but I think it's a fairly robust opportunity set for those of us that have a clear thesis on how to invest in Europe.
And it's a sense that that I certainly have anecdotally, that there are more and more VCs entering the space, both number of funds and size of funds. Is that something that you think holds true? That's not just yeah.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. I think JATO, and others on this panel are probably good examples of that, right? Mm-hmm. I think, recognizing the opportunity in Europe is one of the things that I think allowed us to put together such a solid thesis for the fund and strategy for the fund. Look, I think if you come at this with the notion that in Europe right now, these opportunities don't require every single one to go it alone with a typical syndication that perhaps deals with all of the known players, and instead look at it as, how can strong science be supported from the beginning in a maximal investment thesis? I think, quite frankly, there's great opportunities. And though you're seeing more players show up, it's exactly what the entrepreneurs in Europe and these opportunities need.
And
yeah, I mean, yeah. just to echo maybe some of the points that Rachel is making, which are great. I mean, I'm evidence of the growing awareness of internationally of the quality of startups coming out of Europe. We decided to open a London office late last year to act as a springboard into Europe because of the kind of opportunities that we were seeing coming from here and the recognition. And there's another sort of slight trend that we're starting to see, and the increasingly investors are moving away from the place where they were looking to one geographical location only for their opportunities. There's a recognition that there's a lot of interesting startups and interesting technology coming from a lot of different places and a lot of big varied, and which is the reason we sort of purposefully kept our fund with a global mandate, so we can take advantage of all these locations. And the Nordics, with the history of strong R&D and strong science and excellence in science really and technology, is very well set up for these sort of breakthrough innovations that are sort of bubbling out and all over the place.
Yeah, I think maybe also to add, I mean, I fully also agree that there has been a lot of development and catch up, even a bit, if you can call it like this, in some segments of the market and in some regions of Europe. I mean, we have, as said, and we have some examples here in this panel. And I mean, there's obviously more of those out there, but looking, for example, in Germany, where we are based, that's really still an underserved market in my view when it comes to comparing it also to France, which has done great in comparison in the last, let's say, 10, 15 years or so, in comparison to Benelux and Switzerland, and not to mention the States, obviously. So here we still have wealthy individuals or family offices who are the biggest backers, also of the most recent successes who are IPO'd in the States. And they were necessary. Without them, it would have been impossible to really get those companies funded until this stage. I mean, it's getting better. But yes, again, it depends a bit still on the region. It depends also a bit still on the subsector. So it's probably more true that things are improving for drug development again, than, for example, in the medtech space or diagnostic space, where you really have, or even tool space, where you really have only a very few number of investors in Europe so far.
In Germany specifically, is the effect of the family offices and the kind of wealthy individuals, does that crowd out the space for VCs historically, or is there really a space for VCs alongside?
No, there's for sure space alongside, and we also do have some VCs who actually co-invest with those family offices. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to, we're actually talking about two family offices. That is basically who are dominating the German space. They have very deep pockets, which is needed for the companies to get them to the stage where they are. I mean, there's very, very limited possibilities of going to the capital markets, doing an IPO for German companies again in Europe. I mean, there is some examples on Euronext in France especially, but then most of these successful companies go to the US for an IPO if they want to have an IPO, as also just recently seen. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, but I mean, the question coming back, no, they don't crowd out VCs in my view. There's so much opportunities, so much interesting deal flow, and also European VCs syndicate then in these opportunities. Yeah, I wouldn't say that they crowd out venture whatsoever. It's just not enough venture capital available still in regions like Germany.
Yeah.
John, I may add on that one, because as I mentioned, we have decided a bit less than 2 years ago to open our Munich office based on this statement, and just see that the German environment was underserved, especially early stage, and compared, of course, with the opportunity of strong sciences that many see, and relatively limited number of VC investors, professional VC investors. So I can confess, after 18 months of experience, local experience in Germany, that there are lots of opportunities, and actually this is becoming a very strong dynamics in the Kurma teams, with many opportunities coming out and actually new investments. So proof is in the pudding, as always, and seems to be the case.
And what has the French experience been, Thierry?
Actually, France and Germany are similar to many aspects. Of course, the financial environment is different. We don't have these big families, rich families. And as Sasha mentioned, the French environment, financial environment has developed in the last 10, 15 years, a very strong support from the French public banks, as we all know, BPI, France, which has actually to some extent structured the ecosystem, because they are a strong LP in I would say every France-based funds. So little by little, actually, they have participated in building the ecosystem, starting with early stage funds and gradually going to growth. stage fund where we are today, and I think we will all agree that, of course, this is and Rachel said about continuity in financing, and that's exactly the good way to phrase it. It's still what is missing in all over Europe, but France in particular. Yes.
That's interesting. And you mentioned continuity again of capital and stuff. Sorry, Stefan. And Rachel obviously spoke to that as well. Do you all think of continuity of capital in sort of the same way that, you know, a lot of the kind of life science healthcare funds in the U.S. have come to think of it, which means and can mean, you know, support up and through potentially an IPO, you know, whether it's a very late stage round or a crossover round, and then support in the IPO. Is that what you mean by continuity of capital, or is it something different than that or less than that?
I guess so. It means basically that the company will have support all the way to a potential exit, right? And if that path take the company to an IPO, there should be crossover investor that can do that. And by the way, that's also something that is sorely missing in Europe. So yes, several of the comments before pointed to the lack of early stage capital, but there is also a lack of crossover investors and a specialized field of investors who look at the public companies. In the Nordics, and in particular in Sweden, the lack of capital have driven a lot of companies to IPO. So you have a lot of these micro IPOs. There are different markets that cater to these companies. And although I, of course, completely understand the companies will have to go and attract capital whenever they can get it, or wherever they can get it, a lot of those companies are actually IPO too early. So I think, again, there is definitely a role for specialist, competent investors in all the steps of the value chain and developments of a company. And there are several of these areas where there is a imbalance between available opportunities and available capital.
You know, I would just
go ahead.
Sorry, I would just add to that, John. I think that Stefan's point about the value that especially, you know, from seed up through even Series C or a crossover of having continuity capital is really also to make sure that the value chain is present. I think that's a point that's really important, because we talk about the opportunity for funds and an imbalance, but you also have to look at what that imbalance creates for the companies themselves. And one of the things it creates is a bit of a vacuum. I think Stefan highlighted the IPO route to solve that vacuum. But I think the continuity of capital idea is not just stability, but it's also to really go after the ambition of the entrepreneur with more confidence. That if you come in with capital as a supportive investor early or at B, that at least in our investment thesis, that continuity of capital allows for the acceleration and then the ambition with some stability and support of what the entrepreneur is looking for out of their platform or their pipeline. And that's something, if you look at it not from the venture capitalist perspective, but from the company perspective, where they're living and breathing and have the anxiety of it every day, they may make short-term choices that then hurt maximal value. And I think that's where, when you get, you know, the value chain experts around the table, plus the continuity of capital, which I think is part of the hallmark of JTO, we see that adding tremendous value and supportive value to the entrepreneurs that we invest behind. But it helps, because that imbalance just isn't capital. It's actually a choice-making driver for these entrepreneurs. So I just wanted, Stefan brought the point up, and I thought it was quite an important point about the imbalance and how it affects companies.
No, and Rachel, that's a good point, because actually, there are many risks in biotech, right? Development risk, regulatory risk, commercial risk, but the financial risk is really weighing heavily on these companies. And the poor CEOs, they spend half the time fundraising, all their time. So if you can create already at the early stages a syndicate which have the capability to basically carry the company through. I mean, of course, there will be later financings, and of course, hopefully a successful company will be able to attract additional investors. But sort of what we as investors can do is maybe to work with the portfolio companies to reduce this financial risk and thereby enhance value creation. So the continuity of capital basically is something that investors can provide, where we sort of can enable the management and the companies to really focus on creating the value that we all need.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are all very good points. And Stefan, you very helpfully, I think, brought up the Nordic region, which obviously is a focus of today in this conference. And you brought up the public markets in Sweden and Scandinavia generally, which are clearly more developed and somewhat more mature than in other geographies in Europe. And you also, I think, hinted at sort of the double-edged sword that those public markets present. Companies are often able to go public in a very retail-focused way, I think, or oftentimes raising proceeds that are not really kind of adequate for their pipeline. When you're looking at the Nordic region, and to the extent that your funds are active in the Nordic region, I definitely invite everyone to comment here. But when you're looking at the Nordic region, do you, I guess, specifically with respect to the public markets, do you see them as a potential advantage for your portfolio companies, or is it sort of neither here nor there, given that your hope is that they will have an exit that is not a NASDAQ Stockholm IPO? It's either a trade sale, or if they're going to IPO, it would be straight over to NASDAQ. And I'd be interested as a kind of a side point, if any of you have any experience with public Nordic companies, and sort of what their experience has been. We've had some experience working with Nordic companies that I think, to some extent, I don't want to be trapped is a little bit too aggressive a term, but they're on the Stockholm market with a valuation that may or may not be what they would want to do if they wanted to come into the U.S. and try to list on NASDAQ. And they have a largely retail investor base with very few institutions, maybe some pension funds, and that can be quite difficult to kind of work through if you're trying to get to a more U.S. focused investor base or international focused investor base.
So there's actually been, you're right. I mean, I think you used the word stock, and yes, there are many companies that are sort of in they've grown, they've attracted capital from the local market here, but they need more to grow to the next stage, and they sort of can't reach that. One path could be to go from the Nordic market to NASDAQ in the US, and actually NASDAQ owns the stock markets here, so it's under the same umbrella, but obviously there are different requirements, and that has worked in a few cases, but it's really not for all companies. And I think if the company lists too early, it can actually hurt in several ways. One is when you're a listed company, you maybe lack the owners that have a major chunk of the company that can go in and that can give you strategic direction in the same way that a venture investor can do. And it's also, you're sort of put in one bucket where it is actually quite hard. It's not as straightforward as it sounds to go from a local market here to the main market in NASDAQ in the US. So it requires a lot of work, but it can be done. And there are successful examples of doing that.
Maybe jumping over to Thierry and Sasha, your experiences specifically on the private side with potential investment opportunities in the Nordics, and then to the extent you have had any experience with public companies, and Sasha, after that, to get your thoughts as well, outside of the drug development therapeutic space.
Yeah, we do have experience in the region, and actually quite successful. I would name two Danish companies first that we have invested in and who proved to be developing very well. The first was Zealand Pharma, and this is not a new investment, but I think we all know the company and have seen the progress over the years, and its traditional listing on the local NASDAQ, yes, NASDAQ, but NASDAQ Copenhagen, have a first IPO and little by little attract international investors, because the IPO was with local investors, local pension funds in particular, but gradually gain international visibility, which means to a large extent US visibility, and successfully and eventually got listed on Nasdaq main market. So and the second company, which actually was a bit more recently listed on Copenhagen, is Orphazyme, another drug development rare disease company. So close to registration, hopefully just filed for registration for a rare disease drug. And so listed on Nasdaq, had a pretty successful fundraising history locally. And is actually contemplating also to get listed very shortly on Nasdaq. So this scenario is clearly feasible and possible. It takes time, maybe sometimes, and also what we have experienced at least in these two situations is that the local investors base will not invest in many companies, but definitely there are sophisticated long-term investors in the region that are able to support these companies for good reasons, I would say, just understanding the challenges and the raison d'etre behind, and supporting the local company long-term. So that's actually something that makes this market also different from others in Europe. And this was mentioned before, every regions in Europe are quite different. Also in terms of financial ecosystems and investors typologies. So these are our two Danish successful histories. We have also some experience in Sweden, have gone through a similar story that you said about listing too early a Swedish company and make it a very small micro cap with difficulties to get the sufficient visibility. So we went through this bit painful experience too, but this did not prevent the company to raise sufficient cash to at least develop its programs and go forward. So overall, I think you definitely need to understand the local environment and how to cope with it. But if you do it sufficiently seriously, there are lots of opportunities and there are ways to develop very efficiently these companies in our experience.
And Sasha, and thank you, Thierry. Sasha, in other parts of healthcare, have you had much of a focus on the Nordic region?
Yeah, I mean, we have looked at maybe rather we've looked at companies that were rather well, considering an IPO process and the public listing on the Nordics, and we would have been, if we would have come to terms, actually a bit of an alternative for them, because we are also capable of providing up to 20 million by ourselves, which actually looking at a micro IPO is already quite significant. So we have been in discussions with some of the somewhat recently listed companies in our space. So not drug development, but everything else in healthcare, of possibly doing a capital raise instead of the IPO process, which was already on its way. I mean, obviously, as you can see from our portfolio, we didn't come to terms with any of those companies, but I mean, that would have been an interesting alternative for those companies, I think. Maybe even for the management team, a preferable way, because obviously the company has way less reporting requirements. I know that the companies in our portfolio already are not too happy with our reporting requirements, but get listed and then find out what that means. Right. And the costs associated with that and so on. That's quite an issue. And then also something else maybe to consider. I mean, if we're looking at smaller public listed companies, as we all know, the liquidity is an issue, and also for the investors, or can be an issue at least for the investors also who are invested. It's therefore can be an issue to get out. And public listed companies are always way more difficult to acquire. For a strategic acquirer. So that exit process or exit possibility, I mean, it's not, well, it's less, let's say, likely than if you have a public listed company. I mean, in the States, it's a bit easier from the framework how to actually acquire a company than in many European countries when it comes to regulations for stock listed companies. So there is also something to bear in mind if you are invested in a company and considering an IPO. Well, yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of cautionary tales here for local markets, I suppose.
Yeah, but on the other hand, I mean, I can just echo Terry as well. I mean, in the Nordics, there is for sure an ecosystem which is way, way, way better. I mean, we would love to have that ecosystem already in Germany, for sure. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean, I'm just telling you about the a bit more cautionary topics because we've heard some good things. So I thought I'm going to balance it a bit. Yeah. But,
yeah. No, that's great. I'm just looking at the clock here. We've got we've rapidly been using up our time. I was thinking maybe we would switch to sort of obviously the topic of the last 6 months and talk just a little bit about how the COVID and the COVID environment has impacted the venture space and the life science space. Certainly on my end, we've all been shocked at the kind of resilience and strength of the capital markets in the U.S. It's been an incredibly busy, 5 or 6 months. I certainly didn't foresee that, and I think a lot of other people were, maybe some people were far-sighted enough to see that coming, but it's certainly been a surprise for a lot of us in the U.S. And so, would love to get. Obviously, a bunch of you have also recently raised funds, so. You've had the experience both of not only of making investments and managing your portfolio remotely and through the COVID situation, but also actually fundraising. Petros, maybe if you wanted to comment a little bit, it'd be great to hear kind of what things have surprised you most about operating in this environment, in particular in the VC space and the life science space, and maybe just not to be negative here, but if we make some negative assumptions and a vaccine proves to be more difficult or less effective than a lot of us hope, how you see that kind of potentially playing out and impacting the space that thus far seems to be able to operate very well in these conditions.
Yeah, sure. I think for me it's very interesting that the pandemic has definitely changed a lot of the dynamics in the investments, and you see a lot of the private markets, sort of venture capital investors. They took some time to figure out how to make investments in this new world, and they a lot more conservative with the cash to make sure that they're keeping their firepower mainly for their portfolio companies and to see them making it through. And you've seen the dynamics in the public markets, I think, where they're very hungry right now for biotechs, and it sort of changed the dynamics, I think, right now, where you're seeing a lot of biotech companies rushing to trying to go to IPO sooner. But I think the one thing in my mind is at the back of my head that I'm sort of wondering, and I'd love the opinions of the other panelists as well, is whether where we see this going. And for me, it seems that the public markets are very hungry for biotechs right now, but I don't know if they're used to the risks associated with some of these companies, and whether there's a bit of a bubble right now, even maybe not quite. And where is it going? Because at the moment, if we're seeing there's so much attention on some of the big vaccine companies right now, and if we do get some failures coming up and something's not as effective as maybe the general public think, is that going to hurt the market long term, or is that going to make it create other opportunities and adapt for the private markets?
Yeah, no, I have all the same questions, and to what extent is there real fundamental innovation in healthcare and biotech, that will support the market in the face of negative news, negative macro news, or not, right? Is it really more of a bubble type situation? I mean, obviously, a lot of the IPOs you've seen this year have been, the biggest category has been oncology, right? I mean, it's not directly related to the pandemic at all. But I'd love to throw it out to anyone who wants to prognosticate or make predictions or not.
John, I might weigh in here to just echo. Look, I think when you're in the middle of the reality of a portfolio company that's weighing a choice like that, the golden rule of if the money's available, take it. I just think all of us have seen what happens to companies when they're now public, right? And I think if you go back, 10 months, our discussion of the public markets would be very different, because we could easily name any number of companies who IPO'd and then struggled, quite frankly, under the burden of what the bad news, because we're in companies that typically have longer technology cycles. And so you're going to have the bumps in the road as a public company. I think this current environment then questions, what does that look like? Because the highs are very high. And what happens if now we start getting some pretty deep lows as news on technology comes out? But I think you hit on a really key point, a fundamental point about what I think will be sustaining, and that is a renewed interest in healthcare innovation. And I'd kick it over actually to Sasha to some extent too, which is, how can you use the public markets if you have a solid innovation platform? I will say this, our appetite both for investment, but also how we support the companies, we can't look at the IPO as a route if it's not supported by what it needs to be supported by fundamentally in the inside of the companies. And I think that's where you're going to get the stability you need to sort of navigate this. I'm not going to be the one that, that professes to know what's going to happen next, but I would remark on the difference the 10 months has made. And then the second thing that I would be very interested in hearing this panel on is actually how COVID may fundamentally be changing healthcare generally, and what people are thinking about the broader environment. Because one of the things that's going to happen, obviously, is some deep regulatory thinking, and we've already seen some acceleration of the highest interest vaccines. But are there going to be consequences or opportunities from how these new routes are being paved? We've seen that before with acceleration opportunities. And also then some constraints and some challenges for our health systems, which ultimately, we're going to have to stay on top of as supportive investors for entrepreneurs who are going to have to see how some of these changes outside of the marketplace, but COVID vis-a-vis healthcare, I think, is going to have some basic lasting effects and certainly strains. So I'd be interested to hear how people are actually navigating that as well, even in the midst of all the fervor around the innovation in the biotech space.
Yeah, I mean, if that goes to me, I mean, as I said, Rachel, so I would also agree. I mean, obviously the COVID situation obviously put the spotlight on all types of possible cures, vaccination possibilities, and so on for the time being. But as we all know, I mean, there is long-lasting effects of patients who actually survived the infection, and that will put a big burden on the healthcare systems for sure. So all types of innovation, treating those patients, on the rehab, on their respiratory capabilities. I mean, stroke is way more prominent now. Then we also have obviously a high number of elective procedures and semi-elective procedures as well, because have been postponed, delayed, cancelled, whatever. But I mean, looking at people who got into hospital to get treated for a heart attack, for example, to just mention something, went down by 30%. I don't think that due to COVID we have 30% less heart attacks. So there will be a lot of follow-on effects, not related, partially related, and somewhat related to the COVID effects, and not only the vaccinations and so on will be the ones, the innovation that is needed going forward, in my view.
Yeah. No, I think that as a lawyer who spends most of my time working with companies that are seeking to go public or companies that already are public, I think the big question that that I have is, will investors in the public markets have the patience to support the companies once the returns turn a little bit more negative than they have been this past year. So I mean, I think there's in the U.S. side, there's such a kind of buy side, kind of biotech, kind of almost an industrial complex a little bit, right? I mean, there's so that you have specialist dedicated investors who even in the toughest markets. I mean, I lived through 08, 09, 2010, 2011. And you could finance companies then. You could even occasionally do IPOs, and that was largely on the backs of relying on the kind of the specialists, the kind of usual suspects in the U.S. that are in and around a lot of the deals. But right now it's much broader. Generalists are in the mix, and so I guess my medium-term worry is that the interest of generalists and the patience of generalists may not be there, but they're also looking for yield, and if interest rates remain what they are, and there's nowhere else to put money besides tech and biotech, maybe that's enough. I don't know, but these are bigger questions than certainly that I'm able to answer. We've come almost to the end of time, and looks like we do have one question, and so I'll read that question out and see if anyone wants to take it. If there are any other audience members who want to put a question in, please feel free. I think they pop up on my chat screen. I don't know if you guys can see them or not, but I'll read. So the one question we have is, and I'm paraphrasing here a bit, but given the Nordics regions, I think by that the companies in the Nordics desire to or potentially need to list early on NASDAQ Stockholm, or to list at a smaller market cap or do a micro deal because of the fundamentals of the investor base in Sweden. Do we think does the panel think this is a kind of a longer term issue for the Nordic region in terms of attracting international investors? And I think probably, I assume the question kind of is focused on attracting international investors to NASDAQ Stockholm, to the public markets. Sir, Stefan, you raised your hand.
So, I mean, for most venture investors, most private venture investors actually do not invest much in the public market. So if you take that route as a biotech company, that brings you over in a different sphere of investors. And there's simply, in Europe in general, relatively few generalist investors with a strong appetite for life science. So what you have in Sweden is a lot of small investors, families, private investors, and thus I think the first part of the question from the audience was, given that they have to go that route, I would rather rephrase it and say, ideally, there would be more private investors, there would be more international venture capital coming to the region and helping the companies build value and reach a maturity stage that enables them to go public. And at that stage, maybe even go public in the US rather than in the Nordics, where they can attract a broader spectrum of investors. So I think this point has to be addressed in a different way than just sort of looking at the local Stockholm Stock Exchange exclusively.
I would echo that quite strongly, actually. Not because in any way are we adverse to if somebody's gone public, we'll look, but I think, in that case, it's a complication. right? If it's the initial investment point, as opposed to it's something where we're already in. And we would rather actually try, if the fundraising need is beyond an individual bite size, we're quite flexible. We can go quite small from seed up to the 20 million that Sasha was talking about. Well, if you syndicate, you start to see those numbers, grow. That's, I think, going back all the way to your very first question about how, maybe new funds, but existing funds like Terry's are thinking about, the imbalance and why it's not competitive, it's cooperative. I mean, I think we would rather be sitting at the table in a syndicate pre an IPO talking about how to wait and actually accelerate the entrepreneur, keep the strategic alignment, and then take the valuation opportunity and the exit opportunity at the right time for the company. And so, I would never exclude that route. My hope would be to be in before that and have a syndication route as an alternative if somebody's open to it. So, I strongly echo Stefan's point there.
If I may add one more thing along the same lines, but essentially, if you're excluding yourselves from a lot of the investors in the private markets who have done this before, you're not giving away just the capital. You're also giving away a lot of the experience that would come with that, and a lot of the knowledge and international connections of how to grow and access that international capital, but also grow into those international markets, because in biotech or in medtech in general, you quickly need to outgrow your immediate borders in Europe. And so I think we've been talking about this funding chasm as a threat, but actually from the perspective of an international investor, is actually an opportunity, because once we pick the company that we think is going to be the winner and that fits our investment thesis, then we can take that company and help it introduce them to international capital, our network of co-investors, and help them move into more international markets and actually get a bigger perspective in terms of where should they be going.
Thank you, Petros. I think that those were actually a pretty good way to sum up some of the themes of today's conversation. I think we're at the end of time, so I want to thank everyone for all five of you for joining today. It's been a very interesting conversation, and obviously, for me, just super educational about the VC space in Europe and all that's happening there. Hopefully, I'm over there in person sometime soon. getting a little housebound here, but
yeah.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
So much.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.